When Jacob Weiss began stacking river bricks in a towering spiral inside his Montana cabin in November 1893, his neighbor Samuel Crawford leaned against the doorframe and laughed, until tears streaked his weathered face. The pile looked like the work of a madman, Crawford told anyone who would listen at the general store, irregular and massive, taking up nearly a quarter of the cabin's interior space. What Crawford and the other homesteaders didn't know was that Weiss had spent 3 winters in the Prussian Alps, learning from alpine herdsmen how stone could drink heat from fire and breathe it back for days, and he was about to prove that a man with the right understanding of thermal mass could heat his home with a fraction of the wood his neighbors burned. Subscribe to see how frontier ingenuity challenged conventional wisdom and changed how families survived the brutal Montana winters. The year 1893 brought harsh realities to the newly settled Clark Fork Valley in western Montana. The Northern Pacific Railway had pushed through just 8 years earlier, and homesteaders from across America and Europe rushed to claim their 160 acres under the Homestead Act, drawn by promises of fertile soil and timber. What the land office pamphlets failed to emphasize was the savage cold that descended each November and didn't release its grip until late March. Temperatures regularly plunged to 20 below zero Fahrenheit, with January nights sometimes reaching 40 below. In these conditions, survival depended entirely on keeping a fire burning and a cabin warm enough to prevent frostbite during sleep. The conventional wisdom, endorsed by every agricultural extension guide and promoted by experienced settlers, was straightforward and seemingly logical. A homesteader needed a standard log cabin, 16 by 20 feet, built from logs at least 10 inches in diameter, chinked with moss and clay. Inside, a cast-iron stove, typically a Stewart or a Laurel, weighing between 200 and 300 pounds, should be positioned centrally. These stoves, costing between $12 and $18 depending on size and shipping, represented a significant investment for most homesteaders. The recommended operation was constant feeding, keeping the firebox loaded with split wood every 2 to 3 hours during waking periods, banking the coals heavily at night, and accepting that the cabin would cool significantly by morning, often dropping to near freezing despite the banked fire. This was the method Samuel Crawford used, the method taught by John Fletcher, who ran the land office, the method described in Morrison's Practical Guide to Frontier Homesteading, and the method that nearly every family in the valley followed without question. A cord of firewood, 4 feet high by 4 feet wide by 8 feet long, was considered the minimum weekly requirement for a family cabin during deep winter. An industrious settler would need to put up 20 to 25 cords before the first snow, representing weeks of labor cutting, splitting, and stacking. The work was backbreaking, the consumption relentless, and the comfort marginal at best. But it was what everyone did, so it must be right. Subscribe now to discover how one man's different approach would expose the fundamental flaw in this accepted wisdom. Samuel Crawford's cabin stood as the model of conventional frontier construction, and its performance during the winter of 1892-1893 illustrated precisely why that convention was failing families across the territory. Crawford had built well by every standard measure. His logs were 12 inches thick, carefully selected from straight pines, notched with precision at the corners. He had chinked every gap with a mixture of clay from the creek bed and dried moss gathered from the forest floor. His cast-iron Stewart stove, model number 118, cost him $16.50, a substantial portion of his savings. The cabin measured 18 by 22 feet, slightly larger than standard recommendations, which he believed would provide more comfort for his wife Martha and their 3 children. The reality proved grimmer than expected. During a cold snap in January 1893, with temperatures holding at 32 below zero for 5 consecutive days, Crawford found himself waking every 90 minutes throughout the night to feed the stove. Even with this exhausting schedule, the cabin temperature at floor level, measured with a mercury thermometer hung 2 feet from the ground, dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. The children's sleeping area, partitioned in the far corner, registered 34 degrees. Frost formed on the interior walls, wherever cold air found the smallest gap in chinking. Crawford calculated he burned through nearly 2 full cords of wood during those 5 days, a consumption rate that, if sustained, would exhaust his winter supply by early February. Martha Crawford developed a persistent cough that winter, a wet, rattling sound that kept the household awake and worried. The children complained constantly of cold feet, and the youngest, Sarah, age 4, spent most days huddled near the stove, too uncomfortable to play. Crawford himself found that the constant cycle of chopping wood, hauling it inside, feeding the fire, and snatching brief periods of sleep left him perpetually exhausted. By February, his hands were covered in cuts and calluses that wouldn't heal, constantly reopening with each day's wood splitting. The family's food consumption increased as their bodies burned calories fighting the cold, straining their supplies. This was survival, but barely, and Crawford knew it. He also knew every other family in the valley faced the same grinding reality, so he assumed it was simply the price of settling Montana. Jakob Weiss arrived in the Clark Fork Valley in spring 1892 with a background that set him apart from most homesteaders, though few bothered to learn his story before judging his methods. Born in 1854 in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden, Weiss grew up in a region where winter cold was not an occasional hardship, but a 6-month certainty. His father worked as a carpenter and stonemason, skills Jakob learned from childhood. But more importantly, Weiss spent 3 consecutive winters, from age 19 to 21, working as a hired hand at high alpine huts, where shepherds kept livestock through brutal mountain winters. These alpine shepherds, working at elevations between 4 and 6 feet, where winter temperatures could match or exceed anything Montana offered, had developed heating methods over centuries that reflected a sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, even if they never used such technical terms. Weiss watched them build massive stone stoves, sometimes weighing over 2 tons, that could be fired intensely for just a few hours and then radiate comfortable heat for 24 to 36 hours afterward. The principle was elegantly simple. Stone absorbs heat slowly when exposed to fire and releases it slowly when the fire dies. The greater the mass of stone, the more heat it could store. The key was having enough thermal mass to absorb the intense heat from a hot fire and enough surface area to radiate that heat back into the living space over an extended period. Weiss also learned that insulation mattered as much as heat generation. The alpine huts used thick walls, often 2 feet or more, and the shepherds packed the spaces between inner and outer wall layers with sheep's wool, which created dead airspace that dramatically reduced heat loss. They understood, in practical terms, that keeping heat inside was as important as making heat in the first place. When Weiss immigrated to America in 1889, worked briefly in Pennsylvania coal mines, then pushed west to claim homestead land, he carried this knowledge with him. He also carried the quiet confidence of someone who had seen successful solutions to problems that Americans were treating as unsolvable. When Weiss began explaining his heating plans to neighbors in fall 1893, the reaction ranged from skepticism to outright mockery. Samuel Crawford, who considered himself something of an authority on frontier living after 2 years in Montana, listened to Weiss describe his brick stove concept for about 90 seconds before interrupting. "You're going to what? Stack bricks inside your cabin? And somehow that's supposed to heat better than a proper cast-iron stove?" Crawford's tone mixed amusement and condescension. John Fletcher, the land office manager who stopped by Weiss's claim to inspect his progress, shook his head when he saw the pile of river bricks Weiss had collected from the creek bed. "Those bricks aren't even fired clay," Fletcher said. "They're just river stone. They'll crack from the heat, mark my words. You'd be better off spending your time cutting more firewood like everyone else." The criticism intensified when Weiss began actual construction. He built his stove not in the center of the cabin, but against the north wall, the coldest wall, deliberately positioning thermal mass where it would counteract the greatest heat loss. The structure rose 7 feet high and measured 5 feet wide at its base, tapering slightly toward the top. He used over 800 river bricks, each roughly 9 by 4 by 3 inches, selecting them carefully for density and lack of cracks. The core of the structure contained a firebox measuring approximately 24 inches wide, 18 inches deep, and 20 inches high, lined with fire brick that Weiss purchased from a Helena supplier for $2.30. Around this firebox, Weiss stacked his river bricks in a spiral pattern that created internal channels, essentially a labyrinth that hot gases from the fire would have to navigate before exiting through a chimney pipe at the top rear of the structure. The entire assembly, when completed, weighed an estimated 200 pounds. It looked crude, almost primitive. The river bricks varied in color from gray to brown to rust red. Weiss used minimal mortar, mostly clay mixed with sand, just enough to stabilize the structure. No decorative facing, no attempt to create smooth surfaces, nothing that suggested conventional stove design. To Samuel Crawford and most other settlers who saw it, the brick pile appeared to be exactly that, an ugly pile of rocks with a firebox somehow incorporated into it, taking up valuable living space and representing weeks of wasted labor. Crawford told his wife that Weiss would be begging to share their stove before Christmas arrived. Subscribe to our channel to see the data that would prove Crawford spectacularly wrong. The philosophical divide between Jacob Weiss's approach and the conventional wisdom represented more than just different construction techniques. It reflected fundamentally different understandings of heat, energy, and efficiency, though neither Weiss nor his critics would have articulated it in precisely those terms in 1893. The conventional approach, embodied in the cast-iron stove and constant feeding schedule, operated on a principle of continuous combustion and immediate heat transfer. Cast iron, with its relatively thin walls, 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch on most stove models, heats quickly when fire burns inside and radiates that heat immediately into the surrounding air. This creates rapid warmth, which feels productive and responsive. Feed the stove, feel the heat. Stop feeding it, feel the cold return. The system provides immediate feedback and requires constant attention, which to many settlers felt like proper, active management of their survival. Weiss's thermal mass approach operated on entirely different principles he had internalized from alpine experience but could explain when pressed. Heat, he understood, moves through materials at different rates. Cast iron conducts heat rapidly, absorbing it from fire and transferring it quickly to air. Stone and brick conduct heat much more slowly, which most people interpret as inefficiency. But this slow conduction, combined with high mass, creates storage capacity. When fire burns hot in a firebox surrounded by substantial stone mass, the heat gradually penetrates deeper and deeper into the stone over hours of burning. Once the fire stops, that stored heat begins moving back out, but slowly over many hours or even days, depending on the mass involved. The surface area of the thermal mass becomes critical in this system. A compact sphere of stone would store heat, but release it too slowly to heat a living space effectively. Weiss's spiral stacking pattern created hundreds of square feet of stone surface exposed to cabin air. Each brick face radiated a small amount of heat, but with over 800 bricks, each with multiple exposed faces, the total radiating surface was enormous. The temperature of these surfaces would never get as hot as cast iron stove surfaces during active burning, rarely exceeding 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit at the exterior, compared to 400 to 500 degrees common on cast iron stove surfaces. But the sustained, gentle radiation over extended time delivered more total heat into the living space, while losing far less up the chimney. The conventional stove system also suffered from a fundamental inefficiency that most settlers never recognized. When burning continuously, a large percentage of the heat generated, often 60 to 70%, went straight up the chimney along with hot combustion gases. The cast iron absorbed and radiated only a fraction of the fire's energy. Banking the fire at night reduced heat loss somewhat, but also reduced heat output, leading to cold mornings. Weiss's system, by forcing hot gases through internal channels in the brick mass before allowing them to exit, captured far more of the fire's energy. A thermometer placed in Weiss's chimney pipe during active burning would register 200 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit. A thermometer in Crawford's stovepipe during active burning would show 500 to 600 degrees. That 250 to 350 degree difference represented heat going into Montana air instead of into living space, pure waste multiplied across thousands of fires each winter. The first measurable results from Weiss's system came in mid-November 1893, before any extreme cold arrived, and they caught the attention of Thomas Brennan, a civil engineer working for the Northern Pacific Railway on route surveys through the valley. Brennan, educated at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and trained in thermodynamics as applied to locomotive efficiency, had developed an interest in frontier living conditions after witnessing the hardships faced by railroad workers in winter camps. He carried a calibrated mercury thermometer and kept detailed notes in a leather-bound journal, habits formed during his engineering training. Brennan visited both Crawford's cabin and Weiss's cabin on November 18th, a day when outside temperature held steady at 18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but not extreme. At Crawford's cabin at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with Crawford's cast iron stove burning actively, having been fed fresh wood 30 minutes prior, Brennan measured interior temperature at 56 degrees Fahrenheit at a height of 4 feet from the floor in the cabin's center. The stove's surface temperature, measured carefully to avoid burning his thermometer, exceeded his instrument's range, but he estimated it at over 450 degrees, based on the intensity of radiated heat at arm's length. Crawford mentioned he had fed the stove approximately every 2.5 hours since rising at 6 that morning, consuming roughly 1/8 of a cord of split pine, about 16 cubic feet. At Weiss's cabin that same afternoon, Brennan found a distinctly different environment. Weiss had burned a fire from 6 to 10 o'clock that morning, approximately 4 hours of active burning, then allowed it to die completely. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 hours after the last ember had cooled, Brennan measured interior temperature at 62 degrees Fahrenheit at the same 4-foot height in the cabin center. The surface temperature of Weiss's brick mass varied across its extent, ranging from approximately 130 degrees at the sections nearest the firebox to 95 degrees on the sections farthest from the firebox. Weiss reported burning approximately 1/12 of a cord during his morning fire, about 11 cubic feet, roughly 2/3 the volume Crawford had burned to maintain a colder cabin temperature. Brennan made additional measurements that proved even more revealing. He noted that in Crawford's cabin, the temperature difference between floor level, where his thermometer registered 48 degrees, and ceiling height, where it registered 67 degrees, was 19 degrees. This stratification indicated strong convective currents driven by the intensely hot stove surface. Rising hot air meant falling cold air, creating drafts that inhabitants would feel as discomfort. In Weiss's cabin, the temperature difference between floor and ceiling measured only 7 degrees, 58 at floor level, and 65 near the ceiling. The gentle, radiant heat from moderate temperature surfaces created far less convective turbulence, resulting in more even heating and greater comfort. Brennan recorded these findings in his journal with the notation, "The German system demonstrates superior thermal efficiency through mass storage and extended radiation cycle. Fuel consumption reduced by approximately 33 to 40% for equal or better comfort. Principle analogous to locomotive firebox efficiency improvements achieved through enhanced heat retention and controlled gas flow." He showed these notes to Weiss, who nodded but seemed unsurprised. He showed them to Crawford, who frowned and suggested the measurements must have been taken during an unusual day. "Wait until real cold hits," Crawford said. "Then we'll see whose system works." Brennan noted that response as well, adding, "Subject resistant to data contradicting established practice. Subscribe now to discover what happened when temperatures plunged to test both systems to their absolute limits." When Jakob Weiss opened his firebox door at 6 o'clock on a December morning to begin his daily burn, he moved with practiced efficiency that reflected months of experimentation and refinement. The process he had developed bore no resemblance to the constant feeding approach his neighbors used. Instead of adding wood every few hours throughout the day and night, Weiss conducted a single, intensive burn lasting approximately 4 to 5 hours, typically from 6 to 11 in the morning, though he sometimes shifted this timing based on weather forecasts or his work schedule. The wood he used was prepared specifically for this type of burning. He split his pine and fir into pieces roughly 3 inches square and 16 to 18 inches long, somewhat larger than the thin splits most settlers used for continuous burning. He stacked these pieces in the firebox in a careful arrangement, creating air channels that promoted complete combustion. He used approximately 1/10 of a cord per burn, about 13 cubic feet, which translated to roughly 160 to 180 pounds of seasoned wood depending on species and dryness. The critical phase was the burn itself. Weiss aimed for the hottest, most complete combustion possible. He opened the air intake fully, creating a roaring fire that consumed the wood rapidly and efficiently. The interior of the firebox during peak burning reached temperatures approaching 400 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than a typical continuously fed stove, where temperatures rarely exceeded 800 to 1,000 degrees. This intense heat drove deeper into the surrounding brick mass, and the extended burn time, 4 to 5 hours of sustained high temperature, allowed the heat to penetrate thoroughly through the spiral brick structure. As the fire consumed the wood and temperatures peaked, Weiss monitored the exhaust. When smoke became nearly invisible and the chimney draft created a steady, powerful pull, he knew combustion efficiency was optimal. Most of the wood's energy was being converted to heat, rather than wasted as unburned creosote and particulates. When the fire burned down to coals, he left the air intake open briefly to ensure complete combustion of remaining material, then closed the firebox door completely, sealed the air intake, and adjusted a damper in the chimney pipe to its minimum setting, reducing draft to nearly zero. From this point, no more fuel would be added for approximately 20 to 24 hours, sometimes longer during moderate weather. The brick mass, now thoroughly heated, would radiate its stored energy gradually throughout the day and through the night. The outer surfaces of the brick pile, which might reach 150 to 165 degrees Fahrenheit near the end of the burn, would cool slowly, rarely dropping below 80 degrees even after 20 hours. This meant the cabin temperature, instead of the wild swings between hot and cold that characterized continuously fed stove systems, remained remarkably stable, varying only 8 to 12 degrees over a full 24-hour cycle. Weiss had also incorporated ventilation understanding into his system design. He maintained a small vent near the floor on the cabin's south wall and another near the ceiling on the east wall. These allowed a gentle air exchange rate, perhaps one complete air change every 8 to 10 hours, sufficient to prevent stuffiness and excessive humidity without creating drafts or significant heat loss. The vent positioning created a slow circulation pattern that drew fresh air low and exhausted stale air high, working with natural convection rather than fighting it. The interior arrangement of his brick mass contained additional sophisticated features that became apparent only to those who looked carefully. Weiss had not simply stacked bricks randomly. The spiral pattern created channels that varied in width and orientation. Hot gases from the firebox entered a relatively wide channel, perhaps 3 inches across, that wound upward in a loose spiral. As the gases rose and cooled, transferring heat to the surrounding bricks, the channel gradually narrowed, forcing the gases to slow down and spend more time in contact with brick surfaces. By the time exhaust gases reached the chimney exit at the top rear of the structure, they had traveled perhaps 18 to 20 feet through the brick labyrinth, surrendering most of their heat along the way. This was sophisticated engineering accomplished through empirical observation and practical adjustment, the kind of development that happens when someone understands principles deeply enough to apply them creatively. Weiss had built his first prototype in early September, tested it during cool fall nights, observed its performance, partially disassembled sections, rebuilt them with modified channel dimensions, and repeated this process multiple times before winter arrived. His neighbors, watching him take apart and rebuild sections of his brick pile, assumed he was correcting mistakes born of ignorance. In reality, he was optimizing a design through iterative testing, a process any engineer would recognize as sound methodology. The extreme test that Thomas Brennan predicted and that Samuel Crawford assumed would vindicate conventional wisdom arrived in late December 1893. A massive Arctic air mass, driven by atmospheric patterns that meteorologists of the era could describe but not predict with accuracy, settled over Montana and refused to move. On December 23rd, the temperature at the Clark Fork Valley, as recorded by John Fletcher at the Land Office, dropped to 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. It would not rise above 0 for the next 6 days, and nighttime temperatures would reach 43 below, 46 below, and on the worst night, December 27th, 51 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Samuel Crawford's cabin descended into crisis within the first 36 hours. Despite feeding his cast-iron stove every 90 minutes around the clock, despite burning through wood at a rate that consumed nearly a full cord every 3 days, The cabin temperature at floor level never exceeded 45 degrees Fahrenheit during daytime hours and dropped to 32 degrees by morning. Frost formed thick on the interior walls. Water in a bucket 8 feet from the stove froze solid. Martha Crawford's cough worsened dramatically, becoming a deep, hacking bark that left her exhausted and increasingly feverish. The children huddled in blankets near the stove, emerging only briefly for meals and necessary tasks. Crawford himself fell into a grinding cycle of desperation that pushed him toward complete exhaustion. Every 90 minutes, day and night, he had to wake, dress in layers, go outside into temperatures that made exposed skin painful within seconds, gather an armload of wood from the depleted stack near the cabin, return inside, feed the stove, and attempt to return to sleep before the cycle repeated. The constant sleep interruption, combined with the physical demands and psychological stress, degraded his judgment and coordination. On December 26th, while splitting wood in the dark early morning hours, he swung his axe awkwardly and embedded the blade in his shin, creating a 4-inch gash that bled heavily and would later become infected. The Fletcher family, living a half-mile from Crawford's claim, faced similar circumstances. John Fletcher, proud and stubborn, refused to acknowledge that his recommended cabin-building methods were failing. He burned through wood even faster than Crawford, running his stove so hot that the cast-iron surfaces glowed dull red, creating a circle of uncomfortable heat immediately around the stove while leaving the cabin's perimeter bitterly cold. On December 27th, with temperatures reaching 51 below, Fletcher's eldest son, James, age 14, developed frostbite on 3 toes while doing morning chores, his feet having been inadequately protected in boots that had seemed sufficient earlier in winter. The family gathered everyone's sleeping arrangements within 6 feet of the stove, creating crowded, uncomfortable conditions that prevented genuine rest but seemed the only alternative to dangerous cold. Thomas Brennan, staying temporarily in a construction shanty near the railway survey camp, experienced the cold from a professional perspective that made him grimly curious about how Weiss's system was performing. The shanty, minimally insulated and heated by a small barrel stove, required wood feeding every 45 minutes to maintain even marginally survivable conditions. Brennan found himself burning nearly 2 cords across the 6-day cold snap, while achieving interior temperatures that barely reached 40 degrees. His journal entries from this period became increasingly terse. Deck 24. Intolerable. Deck 25. Worse. Deck 26. Thermometer in shanty reads 34°F at 2 p.m. This is unsustainable. On December 28th, with outside temperature at 37 below, Brennan walked through knee-deep snow to Weiss's cabin, curious whether the German had survived or whether he would find a frozen tragedy that vindicated conventional wisdom's insistence on continuous burning. What he found instead would form the basis for a report he would later submit to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, a report that would circulate among engineering communities and influence building design in cold regions for decades. Weiss answered his door wearing a simple wool shirt and canvas work pants, no coat, no multiple layers. The cabin interior, as Brennan measured it immediately, registered 64 degrees Fahrenheit. The brick mass, which Weiss had fired with his usual 4-hour burn from 6 to 10 that morning, radiated steady, gentle heat. The outer surface temperatures ranged from 125 degrees on sections nearest the firebox to 85 degrees on sections farthest away. There was no ice on the walls, no frost on windows, no frozen water buckets. Weiss's wife, Anna, who Brennan had not met previously, was working at a table near the south window preparing bread dough, wearing a simple dress without shawl or extra layers. Their 2 children, ages 6 and 9, played on the floor with carved wooden toys, appearing comfortable and entirely untroubled by the lethal cold beyond the cabin walls. Brennan spent 4 hours in Weiss's cabin that day, taking measurements, asking questions, examining the brick mass structure closely, and recording detailed observations. He measured cabin temperature at multiple heights and locations, finding remarkable consistency. Floor level averaged 61 degrees, waist height averaged 64 degrees, ceiling height averaged 67 degrees. The temperature gradient, a mere 6 degrees from floor to ceiling, indicated minimal convective disruption and highly efficient, even heat distribution. He asked Weiss about his fuel consumption during the cold snap. Weiss retrieved a small notebook where he tracked his burns and wood usage, a habit that impressed Brennan considerably. Weiss had conducted 1 4-hour burn each day, using approximately 1/10 of a cord per burn. Over 6 days, he had consumed roughly 6/10 of a cord total. Brennan calculated quickly. Crawford, by his own reporting, had burned approximately 2 full cords during the same period. Fletcher had burned even more, perhaps 2 1/4 cords. Weiss had maintained a warmer, more comfortable cabin while burning less than 1/3 the fuel his neighbors required. Brennan asked about overnight temperatures. Weiss retrieved his own thermometer, a mercury instrument he had purchased before leaving Bavaria, and showed Brennan his recorded low temperatures for each night of the cold snap. The coldest morning reading, December 28th. Just before sunrise after a night that reached 51 below outside, showed cabin temperature at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Weiss had slept comfortably under a single wool blanket. No fire had burned in the firebox for over 19 hours at that point. Yet the brick mass continued releasing stored heat, maintaining livable conditions effortlessly. Brennan examined the firebox itself, finding it cold and clean, containing only fine ash. He noted this in his journal with the observation, "Complete combustion evidenced by ash quality. No creosote buildup on interior surfaces. Single intensive burn achieves efficiency impossible with continuous low-temperature smoldering." He asked Weiss if he ever worried that the fire would go out prematurely or that the brick mass wouldn't retain heat long enough. Weiss smiled slightly and said, "I worried the first time I tried it, 3 winters ago in the Alps. I don't worry anymore. The stone remembers the heat. It gives it back slowly. This is not magic, it is just patience." That patience, that confidence in understanding natural processes rather than fighting them constantly, represented a philosophical stance that Brennan found as impressive as the technical achievement. He wrote in his journal that evening, after returning to his miserably cold shanty, Weiss demonstrates that survival in extreme cold is not primarily a matter of fuel availability or hard work, but of intelligent design and thermal management. His system requires less wood, less labor, less constant attention, and delivers superior results. That neighbors resist this evidence reveals how powerfully convention can blind people to better solutions standing directly before them. Over the following weeks, as the immediate crisis of the extreme cold snap passed, Jacob Weiss's cabin became something unexpected, a refuge and gathering point for neighbors who could no longer deny the evidence of their own suffering and his obvious success. The first to arrive, embarrassingly for him given his earlier mockery, was Samuel Crawford. He appeared at Weiss's door on January 3, 1894, haggard and desperate, his leg wound infected, and fever beginning to set in. Martha Crawford, struggling with pneumonia, needed warmth to recover, and their children needed a place where they could sleep without waking cold and frightened every few hours. Weiss took them in without comment or reproach. He arranged sleeping space in the warmest section of the cabin, near the brick mass but not so close as to be uncomfortable. Anna Weiss, who had some knowledge of traditional remedies from her own alpine upbringing, prepared poultices for Samuel's infected wound and made hot broths rich with fat and herbs for Martha's cough. The Crawford children, initially shy and uncertain, gradually relaxed in the steady warmth, playing quietly and eating better than they had in weeks. Within days, other families began seeking shelter or at least spending portions of their days in the Weiss cabin's warmth. The Fletcher family sent their eldest son James, with his frostbitten toes, to recover in better conditions. A Swedish family named Lindgren, homesteading on a claim 2 miles west, arrived in mid-January after their cabin's stovepipe collapsed during a windstorm, leaving them without safe heating until repairs could be completed. By late January, Weiss's cabin regularly housed 8 to 12 people beyond his own family, creating crowding and logistical challenges that required careful management. Anna Weiss emerged as the critical organizer of this expanded household. She established sleeping shifts and meal schedules, ensuring that everyone had space to rest and adequate food despite strained supplies. She maintained strict standards of ventilation and cleanliness, understanding that crowded conditions in winter created risks of disease transmission. She organized the children, both her own and others, into work groups that handled simple tasks like water hauling, dishwashing, and mending, keeping them occupied and useful, while freeing adults for more demanding work. Most importantly, Anna managed the heating system's operation to accommodate the increased load. More people meant more heat loss through increased door openings, more body heat and moisture affecting air quality, and more variable demands on the cabin's thermal environment. She worked with Jakob to adjust his burning schedule, sometimes conducting 2 burns per day instead of 1 during the coldest periods, or when the cabin held maximum occupancy. She positioned people thoughtfully, placing those most vulnerable to cold, particularly Martha Crawford and the younger children, nearest the brick mass, while healthier adults slept in slightly cooler zones. The cabin's temperature, even under this increased load, remained remarkably stable. Brennan visited again on January 15th and measured conditions with 12 people present. Interior temperature averaged 61 degrees Fahrenheit, only 3 degrees lower than his December measurements when only the Weiss family occupied the space. Humidity had increased slightly, but Anna's ventilation management kept it within acceptable ranges. The brick mass, fired with 2 burns of 4 hours each, consumed approximately 2/10 of a cord per day under these high-demand conditions, still substantially less than any individual family had been burning to heat their own separate cabins inadequately. Samuel Crawford, recovering slowly from his wound infection with the help of Anna's care and the cabin's warmth, spent considerable time observing the brick mass system in detail. His initial mockery had transformed into genuine curiosity and grudging respect. He began asking Weiss technical questions. Why this brick arrangement rather than another? Why 4 hours of burning rather than 6 or 2? How the internal channels were designed? What determined optimal firebox size? Weiss answered patiently, sometimes sketching diagrams on scraps of paper, explaining thermal principles in simple terms that Crawford could grasp without formal engineering training. One evening, with the cabin full of recovering families and the January wind howling outside, Crawford made a public acknowledgment that several people present would remember and repeat later. He stood near the brick mass, his hand resting on the warm surface, and said, "I thought Jakob was a fool building this ugly pile of stones. I laughed at him. Every man here knows I did. I was wrong. This system is better than anything I've seen, better than anything I was taught, and I intend to build one on my own claim come spring. I'll help anyone else who wants to do the same." The statement, simple and direct, represented more than just personal admission. It marked the beginning of a shift in community attitude, from resistance and mockery to acceptance and adoption, and the documented evidence that made this shift inevitable began accumulating through multiple channels during the winter of 1893-1894, creating a record that would influence building practices far beyond the Clark Fork Valley. Thomas Brennan's engineering journals provided the most technically rigorous documentation. He visited Weiss's cabin 7 times between November and March, measuring temperatures, fuel consumption rates, and system performance under various weather conditions. He interviewed other settlers, recording their fuel consumption and living conditions for comparison. His final report, compiled in March 1894 and titled "Thermal Mass Heating Systems for Extreme Cold Climates: Comparative Analysis of Conventional and Alternative Methods," ran to 43 pages of detailed analysis, data tables, and technical drawings. Brennan's key findings, summarized in his report's conclusion, presented stark comparisons. The average homesteader cabin using conventional cast-iron stove methods consumed between 18 and 24 cords of firewood per winter season, November through March, maintaining interior temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit during daytime hours and dropping to 35 to 40 degrees overnight. Weiss's thermal mass system consumed between 7 and 9 cords per season, maintaining interior temperatures between 60 and 65 degrees consistently throughout day and night cycles. The fuel efficiency improvement ranged from 62 to 68% depending on specific weather conditions and occupancy patterns. The health impacts, though more difficult to quantify precisely, showed equally dramatic differences. Of the 47 families Brennan surveyed in the Clark Fork Valley during winter 1893-1894, 32 reported at least one family member developing serious respiratory illness. 8 reported frostbite injuries requiring amputation of toes or fingers. 12 reported infections from injuries sustained during woodcutting or handling, infections made worse by cold conditions that suppressed immune response. The Weiss household, even while sheltering additional families during the worst periods, reported 0 serious respiratory illnesses, 0 frostbite cases, and minimal minor injuries. The correlation between stable, adequate warmth and health outcomes could not be ignored. John Fletcher, whose position as land office manager gave him both community visibility and professional credibility, underwent perhaps the most significant transformation. His son James's frostbite injury, which resulted in the loss of 2 toes, haunted Fletcher with guilt and forced him to confront his own stubbornness. In February, as James recovered in the Weiss cabin's warmth, Fletcher spent several days studying the brick mass system and interviewing Jakob extensively. By March, Fletcher had begun drafting new homestead construction recommendations that incorporated thermal mass principles, recommendations he would formally submit to the Territorial Land Office and promote actively to new settlers. Fletcher's revised guidelines published in April 1894 as Recommended Practices for Cold Climate Homestead Construction in Montana Territory, represented a fundamental departure from previous standards. The document recommended thermal mass heating as the primary system for any family planning to winter in regions where temperatures regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. It provided specific design parameters: minimum brick mass of 500 pounds for a standard 16 by 20 foot cabin, firebox dimensions between 20 and 30 cubic feet, internal gas channels with minimum path length of 15 feet, and construction details for proper channel arrangement. The document also addressed fuel requirements and labor allocation, pointing out that thermal mass systems, while requiring substantial upfront labor to gather and stack bricks, reduced ongoing winter labor by approximately 65% compared to continuous feeding systems. Fletcher calculated that a family building a thermal mass system would invest roughly 120 hours of labor in initial construction, but would save approximately 450 hours of labor across the winter season in reduced wood cutting, splitting, and stove feeding. This labor difference was particularly significant for families where one adult worked off the claim or where health conditions limited physical capacity. Merchants in the valley took notice of these developments with commercial interest. Hardware suppliers in Missoula and Helena began stocking firebrick and chimney materials specifically for thermal mass construction. A merchant named Robert Carlson, operating a general store in the settlement that would later become Bonner, began offering brick-cutting tools and mortar supplies while advertising complete supplies for German-style winter heating in the Missoulian newspaper. Carlson visited Weiss in March 1894, proposing to pay him a consultant fee to review customers' construction plans and ensure proper design. Weiss agreed to a modest arrangement, $5 per consultation, which provided him with additional income while spreading the knowledge more widely. By spring 1894, 12 families in the Clark Fork Valley had committed to building thermal mass heating systems before the next winter. Samuel Crawford began construction in April, working with Weiss's guidance to design a system similar but slightly modified for his cabin's dimensions. The Fletcher family planned an even more ambitious project, intending to rebuild their entire cabin with integrated thermal mass principles from foundation up. The Swedish Lindgren family, who had spent several weeks in the Weiss cabin after their stovepipe failure, returned to their claim with detailed notes and sketches, determined to build a system that incorporated both Weiss's principles and their own Scandinavian building traditions. The Northern Pacific Railway, influenced by Thomas Brennan's report, began experimental installation of thermal mass heating in some of its section crew housing along the line through Montana. Company management calculated that reduced fuel costs and improved worker health and comfort could provide significant economic benefits. The railway's adoption gave the system additional credibility and visibility, exposing the design to hundreds of workers who would carry the knowledge with them to other locations as they transferred or left railway employment. News of the Montana thermal mass systems reached beyond the immediate region through multiple channels. Engineering journals published excerpts from Brennan's report. Territorial newspapers ran occasional features about innovative homestead construction. Word-of-mouth transmission through family correspondence, as settlers wrote to relatives back east describing their experiences, carried the information to potential future homesteaders considering Montana settlement. The story acquired some of the character of frontier legend, the mocked immigrant whose ugly brick pile proved superior to conventional American wisdom, a narrative that appealed to people's appreciation for underdogs and clever solutions. 3 years after Jacob Weiss built his first thermal mass heater in the Clark Fork Valley, the landscape of winter heating in western Montana had transformed substantially. A survey conducted by the Territorial Land Office in winter 1896-1897 found that approximately 30% of homesteads established after 1893 incorporated some form of thermal mass heating, either pure masonry mass like Weiss's design, or hybrid systems combining cast iron stoves with surrounding brick heat sinks. The percentage was higher, nearly 55%, among homesteads established by immigrants from alpine regions of Europe who brought similar traditional knowledge and recognized Weiss's system as validating their own cultural practices. The visible evidence of this adoption could be seen in the changing architecture of homestead cabins. Where earlier cabins had featured small, centrally positioned cast iron stoves, newer construction incorporated substantial masonry structures, often taking up an entire wall section. Some builders experimented with variations, L-shaped configurations that heated 2 rooms, horizontal mass arrangements that served as cooking surfaces as well as heating sources, or systems that incorporated baking ovens within the thermal mass structure. This creative adaptation and improvement demonstrated that Weiss had not simply introduced a fixed technology, but had sparked a broader understanding of thermal principles that others could apply and develop further. Samuel Crawford's cabin, reconstructed in 1894 with a thermal mass system, became something of a showcase for the technology's benefits. Crawford, transformed from skeptic to advocate, regularly welcomed visitors interested in seeing the system in operation. He kept detailed fuel consumption records that confirmed dramatic efficiency improvements. His winter 1894-1895 wood consumption totaled 9 cords, less than 40% of what he had burned during winter 1892-1893 in his old configuration. His wife Martha's health improved markedly in the stable warmth, her chronic respiratory problems resolving completely by spring 1895. Crawford himself, freed from the exhausting routine of constant fire feeding, found time for additional activities including furniture making that brought in supplemental income, further improving his family's economic situation. John Fletcher's advocacy from his land office position accelerated adoption by giving the technology official endorsement. New settlers arriving to file homestead claims received Fletcher's revised construction guidelines as standard information. Fletcher personally visited many homestead sites during construction season, offering advice and corrections when he saw designs that deviated from sound thermal mass principles. His son James, who had lost toes to frostbite in a conventionally heated cabin, became a vocal proponent of the technology among his peer group, influencing younger homesteaders particularly effectively. Thomas Brennan's professional career took an interesting turn, influenced by his Montana thermal mass documentation. His report to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers attracted attention from other engineers working on cold weather construction projects. He received consulting requests from mining companies operating in Alaska and northern Canada, railway companies building through Montana and Wyoming, and military facilities in cold regions. This consulting work, combined with his continued railway engineering career, made Brennan a recognized expert on cold climate building systems. He maintained correspondence with Jacob Weiss for many years, occasionally returning to Montana to observe new developments and refinements in thermal mass applications. The winter of 1896-1897 brought another severe cold snap to western Montana, with temperatures dropping below -40 Fahrenheit for extended periods in January. This served as a large-scale test of how widely adopted thermal mass systems performed under extreme conditions. The results, documented in both anecdotal reports and some systematic data collection by local physicians and land office staff, confirmed the pattern established during winter 1893-1894. Cabins with proper thermal mass heating maintained comfortable interior conditions, with minimal fuel consumption, and reported dramatically lower rates of cold-related illness and injury compared to cabins still using conventional heating methods. Jakob Weiss himself became something of a local authority, though he maintained his modest, practical demeanor and never sought fame or recognition beyond fair payment for his consultation work. He continued refining his understanding of thermal mass principles, experimenting with different materials, testing variations in channel configuration, and documenting results with the same careful empiricism that had characterized his original work. In 1897, he built a larger cabin on his expanded claim, incorporating a thermal mass system that served both heating and cooking functions, with a baking oven integrated into the masonry structure that utilized waste heat from the heating channels. This integration demonstrated the broader principle. Understanding heat flow and thermal storage allowed multiple functions to be served by a single, efficient system. The fundamental lesson of Jakob Weiss's ugly brick pile, a lesson that gradually penetrated the consciousness of Montana settlers and eventually influenced cold climate construction practices more broadly, was neither mysterious nor particularly complex. Heat is energy, and energy can be stored as well as generated. Materials differ in their capacity to store heat and their rate of releasing it. Intelligent design matches these material properties to human needs rather than simply maximizing heat generation and accepting massive waste. A smaller, more intense fire that charges a large thermal mass with stored energy serves better than a large, continuous fire that loses most of its energy up the chimney while requiring constant attention and consuming excessive fuel. The social dimension of this lesson mattered as much as the technical dimension. Conventional wisdom, especially wisdom backed by apparent authority, commercial interests, and social consensus, can be spectacularly wrong. The path to better solutions often requires someone willing to look foolish in the eyes of their neighbors, to endure mockery and skepticism, and to trust their own understanding and experience, even when it contradicts what everyone else believes. Jakob Weiss's willingness to build his ugly brick pile despite the laughter, his confidence in principles learned from alpine shepherds despite their contradiction of American frontier conventions, and his patient demonstration through results rather than argument represented not just technical innovation, but social courage. The story also illustrated that technology transfer across cultures and contexts is rarely straightforward. Weiss did not simply copy an alpine heating system. He adapted principles learned in the Bavarian Alps to Montana conditions, materials, and needs. He built with river bricks because that's what was readily available, not because that's what alpine shepherds used. He sized his system for homestead cabin dimensions, not for alpine hut dimensions. He adjusted his burning schedule to match Montana winter patterns and daily rhythms. This adaptive application of underlying principles rather than rigid copying of specific techniques characterized true engineering thinking, the kind of thinking that solves problems rather than merely reproducing existing solutions. By the turn of the century, thermal mass heating systems of various designs had become common enough in Montana and other cold regions that they no longer drew particular attention or comment. They had transitioned from innovation to normal practice, at least among people who took winter heating seriously and thought about it systematically. The ugly brick pile that Samuel Crawford had mocked in 1893 had proven itself so thoroughly that by 1900, A similar structure in a Montana cabin would provoke no comment at all, just acceptance as sensible construction. This normalization represented the ultimate success of Weiss's innovation. It had become invisible through ubiquity, integrated into standard practice so completely that people forgot it had ever been controversial. Jakob Weiss continued his homesteading life, raising his family, improving his claim, and occasionally consulting on heating system design for families and institutions across Montana and neighboring territories. He never sought patents or attempted to commercialize his work in any aggressive way. He charged modest fees for consultation, shared information freely with neighbors, and seemed content with the knowledge that he had solved a real problem and improved life for many families facing Montana winters. When Thomas Brennan visited him in 1903, by then successful enough to travel for pleasure rather than only for work, they spent an evening discussing not just heating technology, but the broader question of how practical knowledge advances. Weiss said something that Brennan recorded in his journal. "The stone does not care about our opinions. It will hold heat or not hold heat according to its nature. The clever man asks the stone what it does well, then arranges the stone to do that thing. The fool tells the stone what it should do, then blames the stone when it does not obey." That principle, simple and profound, applied far beyond masonry heaters in Montana cabins. It spoke to the fundamental relationship between human intentions and physical reality, between theory and practice, between authority and evidence. The ugly brick pile that everyone mocked was only ugly to those who couldn't see past surface appearance to functional excellence. To those who understood heat, energy, and efficiency, to those who measured results rather than judging by conventional aesthetics, the brick pile was beautiful precisely because it worked so well. And in the end, in the frozen Montana winters where survival depended on warmth, working well mattered more than looking familiar. The families sleeping comfortably in 60-degree cabins while burning a third of their neighbors' firewood understood that beauty perfectly.